It is with great pleasure that I met briefly Dr. Stan Hudson this morning, and we welcome him, and we want to give him as much time as we can, and we thank him for coming. Thank you.
First of all, let me tell you who I am. I'm Stan Hudson. It's a long title. I'm the director of the North Pacific Union Conference's Creation Study Center. We actually have a museum at the Union Conference office now on creation. Before I was studying to be a pastor, I was studying to be a geologist. And I was at the University of California at Riverside, as my son would say, back in the day. So anyway, it was a long time ago. But I've always enjoyed the subject of science, and earth science in particular, and also astronomy a little bit. And I just want you to take a look at that picture for just a moment. That is the Deep Space Hubble telescope picture that they took, ultra deep space. I wish you could see it on the monitor here. But anyway, take a look at that for just a moment. This is a star, and that is a star. Everything else you see there is a galaxy. And every galaxy on average has 200 billion stars. So, take a look. If this were as sharp as perhaps this monitor here, you could see 10,000 galaxies in that scene. Now, how big is that area in the sky? Take your pen, your writing pen, hold it up, and the tip of your pen is the size of that area of the sky. Now, for years, the accepted number of galaxies was thought to be about 200 billion galaxies. The University of Nottingham in England just recently decided to restudy that whole question, and they came up with the following discovery or proposal. Add a zero. There are now considered to be 2 trillion galaxies in the universe, times 200 billion stars on average each makes 400 septillion stars. As soon as that was announced on the internet, a mathematician jumped up and said, I know what the next question is, I'm on it. So he calculated the number of grains of sand in every beach on planet Earth and came up with the following proposal that there are more stars in the sky than grains of sand on every beach of the world. So, how big is our God? And every once in a while, I hear some people trying to describe what they think the nature of God is. And I'm thinking, we don't have enough gray matter. We don't have enough to understand the hugeness of the God we serve. Okay, having said all that, today I'm going to talk a little bit about the flood. Now, why do creationists spend a lot of time on the flood? For a couple of reasons. But the biggest reason is you cannot, from science, support a 6-day creation. God said, let there be light, and there was light. How can you prove that scientifically? But what you can show design, and nature can't do it by itself, and all of those things. But in terms of a 6-day creation, you really have to go by faith on that. But you can show plenty of physical evidence for the flood. And if you present that to people, hopefully with an open mind, if they have an open mind, and they see that there's plenty of physical evidence for the biblical flood, maybe they'll accept the rest of Genesis also as historical. So we do spend a lot of time on the flood. So let's take a look. The Bible says that the world was without form and void, and darkness was on the face of the deep, and the Spirit of God was hovering over the waters. Lots of water on planet Earth. If you were to smooth this world down to as smooth as a marble, no mountains, no valleys, there would be 5,000 feet of water covering its surface. So we are not short on water. We got lots of water. But I want you to take a look at what triggered the flood in God's eyes. And it's something that we can probably relate to. The earth also was corrupt before God, and the earth was filled with what? Violence. So God looked upon the earth. Indeed, it was corrupt, for all flesh, and that's a word, those terms include animals, had corrupted their way on the earth. And God said to Noah, the end of all flesh has come before me, for the earth is filled with violence through them. So God was also targeting the animal kingdom as well as the human kingdom because of out-of-control violence. All right, so now I've got a problem with grandmas here today. Okay, grandmas, I'm talking to you. Which ones of you are guilty of presenting to your children toys, coloring books, puzzles that depict the flood this way? Okay, and I see a grandpa also raising hands. Okay. First of all, if you're trying to present that God will always provide a way of safety through the most difficult times that the world is ever going to see, I will grant you that. But that's not the flood. The flood was nothing like this. This is almost fairy tale too, a little bit. The flood was the single worst experience this universe has ever seen, unless you want to consider Calvary as close. It was a devastating event for the universe, for the heart of God, for angels, for anyone watching it, as they saw the loss of life and the terrible destruction that runs against the nature of God. Okay, having said that, now, in any conservative church, Adventist church or other conservative churches, for years there's been an interest in looking for Noah's Ark, right? So we hear stories. Well, the good news is they found it. There it is, on Mars. Well, actually, the problem, I show you that because there's been a lot of sensationalism that's been wrapped around the looking for Noah's Ark. And much of it is not believable. But let's take a look. The Bible says it comes down in the mountains, plural, of Ararat, and that whole region has plenty of areas that look like it could have a boat like the Ark settle. But there are two places that have been long considered possibilities for where the Ark might be. And now, how many of you remember the Cold War? Remember the Cold War when we're all worried about Russia? I grew up in Los Angeles, and I remember in public school there we would have air raid drills. And when the air raid siren would go off, we'd get under our desks because if the Russians dropped an atomic bomb, you'd be safe there. Okay, well anyway, those were the days. And Turkey is right on the border of Russia. In fact, Mount Ararat is in the eastern part of Turkey, not terribly far from Russia. And so for years, the Turks, during the Cold War, were very sensitive about people walking around Mount Ararat because, who knows what kind of trouble they'd get into with Russian border guards. So they didn't want an incident. They kept people away. And whenever you have a government keep anybody away from anything, you're going to have conspiracy theories. What are they hiding? Those Muslims keeping Christians, all of that kind of stuff. Now they're very happy to have Christian groups come over with dollars in their pockets, and they've got an Ark visitor centers and all that kind of thing. So now, plus with satellite imagery, we can look at every square foot of Mount Ararat. There's nothing hidden. And the two that have been proposed, the sites have been proposed, is this one right here where there's a rock formation looking thing that has a couple of dimensions kind of close to the Ark. I don't know if you've ever heard of Ron Wyatt. Ron Wyatt has promoted this site as being basically the petrified remains of the Ark. This has been looked at very, very carefully by a number of creation scientists who have no problem with believing in the flood. But is this the Ark? And the vast majority consistently say it is a rock formation. And that's based on other rock formations in the area that are similar. There is another place on Mount Ararat where supposedly there's a gorge you could walk up. And back in the World War I era, a father took his son up this gorge, found a large object like this with a stairway on it, put his son on it. The son walked up here and along the top and gave stories later. Well, we can go up that gorge now, and there's nothing up there. So the most conservative creationists that I know that have researched this thoroughly believe the Ark is not on Mount Ararat. And I have a theory about what happened to the Ark, and it's a great theory because you can't disprove it. I think once they got off the Ark, they looked around, they didn't see any Home Depots, no Lowe's, no Walmarts, no nothing, no forests, nothing to build with. I think they stopped, turned around and looked at, well, I guess we know what we're going to use to build things. And so I think they probably dismantled the Ark and used it. Ancient people are very good at that. So I kind of think that's what happened. Anyway, But you can go to Kentucky and see the Ark. How many of you have heard of this? This is a full-scale model of the Ark built by the Answers in Genesis Creation Ministry. That's a non-denominational ministry. That's the largest creation ministry in the world, and they're based back there. So they built full-scale an Ark at the cost of $100 million. Anyway, they did build it in the shape of a boat. I have a little problem with that, but other than that, it's absolutely fascinating. This is opening day about a year and a half ago. And about 2 years ago now, actually. There are 3 decks inside. The bottom deck has hundreds of animal cages made out of wood with fake animals inside and fake sounds, on the recordings and so on. The second deck has Noah's family, basically quarters, as well as storage, lots of bags and jars of storage. And then the top level has science exhibits, which I really went to go see. That's what I wanted to see because we were setting up our museum at the time. I wanted to see what they had for ideas. Very well done, not over the top. And then the other part, in the back part, is a full story of the fall from Adam and Eve all the way to the second coming of Christ. So it's a full gospel presentation, very well done, and I love it that they're frankly that bold about it. So anyway, if you ever get a chance to go, it's near it's near Cincinnati, if that helps you. I don't know how many people put Kentucky at the top of their vacation list, but anyway, you might want to consider doing it. Very, very interesting, very well done. Now, if I'm a Bible cynic and we talk about the history of the flood stories, pardon me. You're right, thank you. Save some money. Don't go to Kentucky. You can see it here local, that's right. If I'm a Bible cynic, I would know about the history of the Babylonian flood story called the Gilgamesh epic. It's recorded on cuneiform tablets. And in this story, the Babylonian gods, were angry with man, and they flooded the world to try to destroy man. But a fellow by the name of Utnapishtim kind of snuck onto, I forget if it was a log or a raft, but somehow survived and repopulated the world and so on. That's kind of interesting. That was recorded 600 years before Moses could have written Exodus down. Now, if I'm a Bible cynic, what do I think of the Hebrew story of the flood? I think it's a Hebrew version of a Babylonian myth, basically. But guess what? There's a lot of cultures that have flood stories. For instance, not only the Babylonians, but the Egyptians, the Assyrians, the Sumerians, they all have flood stories. Let's go to Europe. The Romans, the Celts, the Greeks actually had the date of the flood very close to the Bible date. Let's go to Africa. These are all pre-missionary contacts that they had memories of the flood. Zairians, Nigerians, even the Pygmies. Let's go to Asia. The Koreans, the Mongolians, the Eastern Russians, the Philippines, the Siberians, even the Chinese have a lot of early references to the flood in their characters, their letter characters. Let's go to Asia, to South Pacific. This would be the Aborigines in Australia, the Hawaiians even, Tahitians, Maoris in New Zealand, all have flood stories. Let's go to the Americas, and some of the most ancient tribes like the Inca and the Mayans and the Toltecs, as well as more modern tribes like Choctaw and Cherokee, and even Eskimo, have flood stories. This is the Smithsonian Institution's Native American History Museum back in Washington, D.C. I don't know if you knew they had their own building. They do. History of Native Americans. The top of the building winds up like a teepee up to the top. You go up to the top, and they have the oldest displays there. There was a Native American woman tour guide who had a group with her. And she's showing the things that were in the museum there. And she said to her group, she turned and said to them, now my people, talking about her tribe, my people have a flood story. You people do too. And then she paused and she said, maybe there's something to it. And I thought, in the Smithsonian Institution, yay, only a Native American could get away with that. But anyway, yes. And the point is, maybe there's something to it. Because of all these tribes and memories, none of these have memories of great forest fires or great earthquakes or great hurricanes. They're all similar, and they have usually this idea: the gods were angry with man, tried to destroy man, and somebody cleverly survived. Now, it's only in the Hebrew story where God provides a way of safety to replenish the world. Interesting. Okay, so maybe there's something to it. So the standard understanding for Western Europe and Western culture for centuries was, when you see the mountains and valleys, you're looking at the remnants of the flood, the evidence of the days that the fountains burst forth, including volcanic fountains, burst forth and so forth. That shaped the world we saw. But then something happened in our universities a couple of hundred years ago, and that was the rise of secular humanism. Now, we as Protestants are part of this pendulum swing, and I want you to understand this historically. Go back to the 1500s or so. You have some people that were tired of the authority of the Pope, and therefore they protested that authority. They protested that authority, and they separated out. You could go a couple hundred years later, and governments and people are tired of kings and queens and decided to start things like parliaments. So because they were the authority kind of wore on them. Well, you keep on going another couple hundred years into the age of reason, and people are tired of all authority, including God. And that was the age of reason. And so you see this pendulum swing against authority, basically. So the rise of secular humanism and the decline of Christianity, dare I say it, Europe is now post-Christian in culture. Sad to think. And America, I'll just leave it to you to decide where we are on that scale. So you have people like this coming along saying, he's the father of modern geology, James Hutton. He proposed uniformitarianism. Now, what's that? That everything that we see in the world going on in terms of erosion and all these different things going on the Earth's surface, it's always been that way, always been that speed. Absolutely not a catastrophe. Everything is uniform. This is the idea. Go to the Grand Canyon, take a look at the Colorado River coming out. How much dirt comes out in 1 year? Do the math. How much is missing in the canyon? Do the math. That's how old the canyon is. End of story. Don't go anywhere further. So that's uniformitarianism. Does that make sense? Everything is gradual. Now, so the idea of that is the present is the key to the past, understanding the past. And incidentally, uniformitarianism is everything in science. Dating the Earth, you name it. It's all based on these assumptions. So that's been the standard understanding for a couple of centuries now, until a guy from University of Washington, a UW. I've done this talk in Pullman, Washington State. Go Cougs. And, I said, sorry, guys, this was a Husky, University of Washington geologist. This fellow went up to Dry Falls. Anybody here been to Dry Falls? Dry Falls in kind of a north central Washington, near Grand Coulee area. And he went there. It's very interesting to look at. He went there and he said, no, wait a minute. There's these cliffs here that look like they were carved by water. In fact, this looks exactly like the Niagara Falls, but with the water turned off. Now, there's a little bit of water down below there, but something carved these cliffs that's not doing it now. Now, what he just was thinking was forbidden. To think of anything happening in the past that's not happening now. That's against uniformitarianism. So, he said, guys, talking to the geologists of America, I think something happened here. And they said, well, it couldn't be a flood because we don't believe in floods. Besides, where are you going to get the water from? And so he went up to Missoula, Montana, which is upriver from there. And Missoula, Montana, if you've been there, you can see the shorelines on the hills all around Missoula, Montana. And you can see them as clear as anything. I was there a few months ago, and there was snow, and you can still see the shorelines. So he did his work. He figured out that during the Ice Age, and incidentally, creationists believe in the Ice Age and we have an explanation for the Ice Age. And in science today, take a look. The literature is full of scientists who are saying we do not have any clue what caused the Ice Age. No clue. Creationists have a clue, and it had to do with the flood. But anyway, so during the Ice Age, ice came down and blocked the Clark Fork River and backed up water around Missoula, modern-day Missoula, into what we call Lake Missoula. Enough water there to be something like Superior, Lake Superior, okay? That big of a lake. And during the Ice Age, actually broke through the ice dam and emptied out that lake in a matter of 1 to 2 days. Now think of the force of that water. That force of that water came right down through here and right over Dry Falls, right through Spokane. Now I used to live in Spokane and lived up the side of a hill. And whenever we wanted to plant plants, got the shovel out, always hit these round river rocks. And we looked around, there are no creeks, no rivers around here. Where did these round river rocks come from? From this event, the Missoula flood. So the water came down here, right out the Columbia River Gorge, widened it quite a bit, carved it out. Some of the water spilled over into the Willamette Valley. All of that happened in a matter of 1 to 2 days. The thing that's interesting is Brett's proved this over and over again with more data. It took them 40 years to get the geologists of America to accept that there had been this flood there. Remember, they're anti-flood, anti-catastrophe. So finally, he got them to actually go to the site and look for themselves, and they contacted him and said, okay, Harlan, we're catastrophists now. You've convinced us. Something happened here. Now, what's interesting is, and he was still alive, he's an old man by this time, he then said, you know what we need to do? We need to take a look at the Grand Canyon now, because the Grand Canyon gives evidence of being rapidly formed. Well, let's take a look. Now, where were you on May 18, 1980, when Mount St. That's a before picture, when Mount St. Helens lost 1,300 feet in a matter of a few seconds, which is more than the Empire State Building. Where were you on that day? And looking around, some of you were somewhere. 1980, on that Sunday morning at just shy of 8 o'clock, when Mount St. Helens blew its top with a force of an atomic bomb every second during the eruption. 47 people died. 8 of them were in areas considered unsafe and were mostly in those areas with permission. 49 of them were in areas considered safe to be, and it's because the eruption was much larger than they anticipated it would be. So, what did we learn on the subject of catastrophism? Incidentally, let's think about volcanoes for a minute, because I love volcanoes. I got to do something that every red-blooded American male wants to do once in their life. I got to play in lava. How cool is that, right? Guys, wouldn't that be cool? So anyway, on an anniversary, ladies, it was an anniversary, so that's good. Took my wife to Hawaii. Anniversary, okay, points there. But anyway, so I went up to a place where the lava was, okay, real quickly. Parked the car, the lava, this is the big island of Hawaii, the Kilauea event, which has been erupting now for about 60 years nonstop. Parked the car there where the old lava had come across, and then you had to get out and walk. There was a ranger kiosk there, a woman inside, and I spoke to her and I said, I'd like to go up to where the lava is coming out. Can I do that? What did I expect to hear? No. Instead, she said, sure, just be careful. It's right up about, she pointed out where to go, so off I went. Thank you very much. I had a metal cup with me that I'd purchased the day before, and in my intelligence, I thought all I had to do was just very carefully scoop out a little bit of lava into this metal cup. You know, just kind of, I'll bet it's hot. So anyway, it's kind of... Okay, guess what? Have you heard it's hot? It's really hot. Really, really hot. So I had to put this metal cup on a rock, and the closest I could get to the lava was about me to that chair. Now, I had a long stick that I'd picked up along the way, so I poked it in the lava that was coming out, and it caught fire and dropped, caught fire and dropped. Oh, there's some that stuck. And I put it into this cup and pushed it down. Had my water bottle, poured it in there, and there's my illegally collected bit of lava from Mount Kilauea, Kilauea Vent. Why I wanted to get this for a number of reasons other than just how cool is that to play with lava? I mean, it's just totally fun. Someday I'm going to actually break a piece of this off and send it to a laboratory and get them to date it for me. Because the millions of year dating system is based on lava, dating lava. And I'd like to know, because I was there the day this rock was born. So I'm just curious to see what kind of date I'll get on that. Okay, had to tell you about that cool stuff, that story. But anyway, think about, where'd it go? So let's talk about volcanoes for just a moment. Volcanoes, think of them as bumps in the ground. Something's trying to get up, makes a mountain, and that's a volcano. Well, think of volcanoes as two kinds. One, the top of it is like it's cracked. It's got places, soft places. And so lava, when it's coming up, can simply find a place to go out and flow on out. Now, that's what Kilauea is in the Big Island. It's flowing out, it's into the ocean, and it's making more Hawaii all the time. It's a good thing. Other kinds of tops are like corks with no cracks, no nothing on it. They're corks on the bottle. That's what Mount St. Helens was. And the pressure built and built, and the north face of Mount St. Helens started to push out about 5 feet a day toward the end. 5 feet bulging. Finally, there was a little bit of a tremor, and the north face simply broke off and slid down the side of the mountain. As it slid down, that was the cork off the bottle. So you can see right there, that used to be up here. It's sliding down now, and as it's sliding down, that's relieving pressure, and bam, out it comes. And the force of the blast taught us something about catastrophes. Now, what came down, the force of the blast came down at 300 miles an hour. You cannot outrun 300 miles an hour. Plus, it was superheated. And this is what it did. It made many, many square miles of giant toothpicks. Now, the heat of that blast came down and vaporized the bark, the branches, the needles, and left just logs. But think about the power of the force of this blast, because it literally knocked trees off of their bases. Pop, 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 pop. Think about that for miles. Think of the force that would take to knock these trees over. Anyway, there you can see them in the upper left picture. The guys that are in Spirit Lake there down at the bottom right are actually creation scientists, and they got permission to study the logs in Spirit Lake. And this is looking at the north face of the mountain. Now, what did they find as they studied these logs? They found that after a while, they started to float like this, and then they went like this, and then they sunk into the soft bottom of the lake. Here's one they're taking a picture of looking up, floating straight up and down. Here's one that's already stuck in the bottom of the lake. Then they asked for permission to go to Yellowstone National Park to study Specimen Ridge. Specimen Ridge has got the famous petrified forest up and down the sides of this mountain with many layers in between. And he's got these huge trees sticking out of the ground that are solid rock, as in solid rock. You can't put your arms around them. These are huge trees. So how did they get there? Because with all these layers and all these trees sticking up, the thought has been there's a snapshot of 100,000 years right there. It had many ages to make all these trees because they grew, they got covered, they got petrified, more layers, more trees, it would take forever, they thought. Well, guess what? Same scientists asked for permission to dig around the base of these trees. What were they looking for? Roots. If they found roots, what did that say? That they were petrified where they grew. But if there are no roots there, then they were not petrified where they grew. They got transported to this place. And turns out, no roots. In fact, down at the bottom, they checked some of the rings of trees down here, compared them with trees up here, found out they had all been growing together. So the fact is, this was something like Mount St. Helens and Spirit Lake, many times larger. And these trees were floating in this lake until they sunk and got covered. So this was from a catastrophe. And this was not uniformly done. This was done quickly. And I was in the park in a bookstore there, and I was listening to a DVD that had sights and sounds of Yellowstone. And they got to the petrified forest, the Specimen Creek, Specimen Ridge. So I wanted to hear, what do they have about that now? We now know, thanks to studies down in Mount St. Helens, that all of these trees were petrified from a volcanic action that took place in the past. And I thought, oh, well, there you go. And I thought, okay, let's see if they give credit to creation scientists. No, that's okay. But nobody else would have asked those questions. So they've changed their interpretation based on that work there. The other thing we found out from Mount St. Helens was you can make a little Grand Canyon really quickly. Now, I don't know if you can see these layers very well, but there's flat layers right there. There's flat layers over here of rock. These are graded beds, and these were all done in the same eruption, the same deposit. And with flat layers, and then the water, of course, carved a canyon through those flat layers. Those layers have now become hard as rock. But take a look at this place here, and you've got huge flat layers, one top of the other, representing millions of years, supposedly. Those flat layers supposedly were the top of the ground for millions of years, and then another layer flat for another million years, and so forth, right on up. The thing that's interesting to me is if it's flat and it's the top of the ground, how can it remain perfectly flat? Wouldn't you think over time water and things would put little valleys and little kind of move it around a little bit, not perfectly flat? I don't know of any place in the world that's perfectly flat, and that includes even Kansas. So nothing's perfectly flat, and yet supposedly we have flat areas here that represent millions and millions of years of flatness. Some of these deposits are the size of a state, and it's very hard to explain this. So it looks like really these were wrapped. There doesn't appear to be age between these layers. Looks like they were all laid down very quickly. Now, have you ever been to here? Where's this? Utah-Arizona border, Monument Valley, right? Take a look at these monuments, and this is a really spectacular thing to look at. Take a look. If you drew lines across the top here, you can tell that used to be the top of the ground. Had to be. So where did all this material go? Because it's certainly not down below. It's not even the same zip code. It's gone. It's way out of there. And there's only one thing that will take cubic miles of material and deposit them somewhere else, and that is a lot of water with a lot of force. And it would even help if those layers were soft at the time. So anyway, and incidentally, that's up above, that's upstream from the Grand Canyon. So even evolutionists will admit that what you're looking at here has to do with some kind of what we would call a drainage event, water draining off of probably continents rising. We believe continents rose toward the end of the flood, and that's how water got collected into the oceans. As the water was draining off, it would do things like this, including the Grand Canyon. Anyway, so do you know who this fellow here is? Anybody? Dr. Art Chadwick of Southwestern Adventist University, head of the science department. He is a good scientist, a great guy. He asked the Grand Canyon people, can he study the Tapete sandstone at the bottom of the canyon? Yes, got permission, and that's in this area right here. That is the beginning of the fossil record. And that means there's no fossils down here, but fossils continue up. So for creationists, this is the beginning of the flood. For evolutionists, this is the beginning of life right here. So he wanted to study it, and prior to his studying, this was considered to not have a lot of water involved in its deposit. However, he showed that it was what's called a turbidite. And what's a turbidite? A turbidite is not only water involved, but actually the material that deposited was flowing underneath water. Okay, and then settled out, because you can tell the way the grains settle that it was in water, and he proved that it was a turbidite. In other words, the beginning of the flood had lots of water, beginning of the fossil record. The question has always really been, and science is based on attempting to answer a question. You got a good question, you'll probably get better science. Here's a good question. Looking at the crust of the earth, we know water's been involved. What explains better what we see? Something that has a lot of water with little time or little water over much time. And that's really kind of where it boils down to. Of course, you know where we are on this. And again, it has to do with what glasses you're looking through to interpret things. Okay, class, let's see if you remember. What are the three basic kinds of rocks? Sedimentary, let's start with sedimentary rock. It's made up of sediments, limestone, sandstone, shale, coal, salt. All of those are sedimentary rocks. It's very helpful to think of sedimentary rock in the following way. Destroyed rock. In other words, made up of tiny bits of pieces of previous rock, right? And been beaten up and pulverized and made into new rock. Think of it that way, sedimentary rock. Now, igneous rock, think of igneous as ignited. Something was hot before it cooled. And that includes especially basalt, which is lava. And then metamorphic rock is one of these two kinds of rocks that have been cooked into something else, like marble. Now, sedimentary rock is 3/4 of the rocks we have in the world is sedimentary rock. Look at the Grand Canyon. That's almost all sedimentary rock. Sedimentary rock needs water. Think of cement. Just add water. So you can tell by the amount of rock we have, that sedimentary rock, that water has been very involved in the formation of the rock that we have on the earth. So what is the evolutionist Bible? And it's not Origin of Species by Darwin. It is the rock layers, the geologic column, because they believe in this we have the inerrant record of the Earth's history. I more or less agree with that, but how you interpret it, it's everything. So this is a standard view with millions of years. Please don't believe or say that I believe in millions of years. I've always had occasionally somebody say something like that. I do not believe it. I'm just showing you this is a standard model. And okay, so Paleozoic, Mesozoic, Cenozoic, early, middle, and recent life, and supposedly represent millions of years. Now right there in the Cambrian, Precambrian layer, life appears, fossils begin. And guess what? Out of the 35 kinds of critters, we've already got 32 of the 35 types of critters right at the beginning of the fossil record. So in other words, instead of having 1 or 2 or 3 or 5 and branching out into other things, we got everything pretty much at the beginning. Like a trilobite. Ever heard of a trilobite? Trilobites are extinct, but they used to be anywhere from that big to this big. And think of them as, I don't know, water cockroaches or something. That's probably not nice. But anyway, they lived around the edge of water, got to be the first things that got covered in the flood. But what's interesting about them is their eyes. And the eyes. There are trilobite nerds, collectors. There's associations of trilobite lovers. There's a whole world out there. Trilobites are interesting. There are many species, but the eyes are what's interesting because some of them have eyes like yours and mine. Some have eyes like insects. Some have eyes like fish. Some have eyes on poles. Every conceivable kind of eye. Now, why is that interesting? Because in evolution, eyes are among the most difficult things to explain how they evolved. Because supposedly there was a light-sensitive patch on the outside of an animal, and somehow can tell when there was light on, off, somehow drawn to it. And anyway, after a while, this supposedly evolved into a focusing eyeball. Now, you can see, that might take a little faith to believe that, but that's what they believe. Well, when you have an animal at the beginning of the fossil record that has all the kinds of eyes, that's hard to explain. So fully functioning, very complex life immediately at the beginning of the fossil record. And Dr. Roth, who's an Adventist scientist, has talked about this and talks about the Cambrian explosion and that nothing really new happens after that line. Okay, moving on. Charles Darwin believed that everything happened with tiny, successive, slight modifications. In other words, he believed evolution happened little bitty, tiny bits over a long period of time, because little bits over a long period of time means big bits, big changes. That's what he thought. So here's the idea. This is great-great-great-great-great-great-grandpa down here. And somehow life, and they still don't know what caused life. That's the biggest debate so far. But anyway, early on, plants developed out of this, and animals without backbones and animals with backbones. Okay, now here we are next to monkeys and lemurs because we look like them. That is scientifically correct, what I just said. We are related because we look like them, and anything that looks like something must have had a common ancestor. Okay, there you go. But there's one quote. If you get no other quotes all day long, including the afternoon seminar, this science quote is the best one. Here it is. And it's by what I consider to be the Pope of evolution, Stephen Jay Gould of Harvard, the Harvard biologist. Always good for a quote, was on every PBS, Nature, Nova program, National Geographic about evolution. But this is what he said, biologist at Harvard. The extreme rarity of transitional forms in the fossil record persists as a trade secret of paleontology. What's a trade secret? What's a trade secret? Do you talk publicly about that, or do you talk to just your peers about that? You talk among your own. Gentlemen, ladies, we've got a problem in this area. But you never get quoted on public social media, right? The extreme rarity of transitional forms in the fossil record persists. In other words, continues as a trade secret of paleontology. The evolutionary trees that adorn our textbooks have data only at the tips and nodes of their branches. The rest is inference, however reasonable, but not the evidence of fossils. Do you hear what he's saying? Let me go back to this. He's saying that it's a secret. We don't tell anybody. We don't have any fossils right here. We don't have any fossils. All we've got are dinosaur fossils, frog fossils, fish fossils. We don't have any pre-fish, pre-frog, or pre-dinosaur fossils. Did you hear that? And that persists. In other words, it continues on and on no matter what they find. They cannot find any missing links. You've heard of this before? The links continue to be missing, and it persists as a problem. Take a look. Missing links. And again, Darwin knew about this, but he assumed, and he said in his publications, they're going to find more fossils, going to fill in all those gaps, not a problem. So guess what? We have found more fossils. This is an evolutionist complaining about this problem. We are now 120 years after Darwin. The knowledge of the fossil record has been greatly expanded. We have now 250,000 fossil species, but the situation hasn't changed much. We have even fewer examples of evolutionary transition than we had in Darwin's time. In other words, in Darwin's day, they had some things they thought might work. But eventually, they found more fossils and said, no. Let me give you an example. Have you ever seen this in a book? Horse evolution. Supposedly a little bitty horse with multiple toes evolved into a single big horse with a single toe, which is a hoof. Okay, looks good. Pictures look good. Kind of believable. Only problem is, fossils don't show that. Okay, when you ask them about this, they will admit that. But they say, so why do you keep it still in the books? Because we think it presents a model that we would like to promote. In other words, we believe that the model has some veracity, even though the evidence doesn't support it. That's science today. So, okay. For instance, evolutionists believe that a bat is a mouse that grew wings. Now, it kind of looks like that. You can imagine it. Here's the problem. What did Darwin say again? Little tiny changes. So if you dig down below bat fossils far enough, and there are fossils below bats, look down there. Let's see if we can find a 90% bat, 10% mouse, keep going down to 50-50, all the way down to full mouse, right? Doesn't happen that way. We've got bat fossils and mice fossils, and that's all we got. Nothing else. And that's consistent. Folks, that's the way it is in every single species. In fact, you take a look at these kinds of critters. Whenever you see them, you know what you got. It's a body type that's very distinct and different. You know what it is. And we do not have any fossils for those guys. I'm going to show you now a very significant fossil. This fossil is from the most famous quarry for fossils in the world, and that is the Solnhofen quarry in Germany, where they found the Archaeopteryx. If you've ever heard of that, that's the bird they thought looked a little bit like a lizard and a bird combo. This is from Germany, and this is Jurassic layer, so they think this is 130 million years old. This is a shrimp, and you tell me if it looks any different from any shrimp today. And don't tell me this was on your dinner plate last night. But anyway, this shrimp shows absolutely no difference from any modern day shrimp, right down to the number of antennae. Everything else is very, very similar. So the fossil record consistently is not the friend of evolution. And that's what Stephen Jay Gould was saying of Harvard. So, can you see this? This is a shrimp, and there's no question about what it is. And that's what we have with these things. Take the very unique in shape, and you would think that we could tell if something below it is on the way to it. Now, some people, there's a scientist who came up with an idea, said maybe hopeful monsters would explain it. In other words, maybe the best way to explain this is a mouse had a bat for a baby. It fits the fossil record better. Give them credit there, but imagine the biological problems you got to figure out there. Not only does it, okay, you have a baby now, that baby's got to find another baby, basically, to make a new bat is with, yeah, okay. And that happens supposedly many, many times. So, okay, let's keep going. How do you get a fossil? How do you make a fossil? How do you get fish fossils like this? And take a look at the beautiful detail of this fossil here. This fellow was an evolutionist, and I liked him because he said all kinds of crazy stuff that was very helpful for us. In other words, he was very honest about the problems they had. The explanation of the origin of fossils by the theory of uniformity in evolution contradicts the fundamental principle of those theories, that nothing took place in the past, it does not take place in the present. Notice what he says: today, no fossils are formed. And that contradicts their basic idea that everything is continuing on uniformly. It says today no fossils are being formed, and yet we have billions of fossils, 95% of which are marine fossils, which tells you something about that. Now, okay, I have the very difficult duty. Somebody's got to do it. I've got the very difficult duty of every late January, early February, traveling all the way out of the beautiful Pacific Northwest down to Tucson, Arizona for a week down there. Someone's got to do it. So it's a tough job. But I go down there because that is the annual gathering of the rock, mineral, and fossil dealers of the world. And they gather there with all the new discoveries and everything else, and they put their display on. They take over Tucson, Arizona. There are thousands of dealers there. And it's for anybody who likes rocks and fossils, it's heaven. So anyway, it doesn't hurt to be in Tucson in January either. So went down there, and this same year, went down there, and one day I was praying to God before I went out to the dealers that day, that help me find something that helps me with my talks. Okay, and I go to this place here that we're selling these kinds of shells. Look how beautiful that is. Beautiful. It's an ammonite, which is a nautilus kind of shell, a fossil shell, ocean going. Beautiful colors, very unique the way the colors are. And I asked the fellow, could I take a picture of this? And he said, sure. And he was from the mining company. Tell me about this thing. He says, well, there's only one place in the world that they come out like this, and it's in Alberta, Canada, in the Rocky Mountains. I said, can you help me understand how it was formed? And I knew he wouldn't be a creationist, but I was curious to see what he'd say. He says, well, I don't know about how it was formed, but I can tell you this. It's buried under 6,000 feet of sediment. Sedimentary rock, 6,000 feet above it. Now, you tell me, if you have any explanation where you can lay a mile, more than a mile of sediment on top of anything, bury it that deeply with that pressure on top of this, and this is an ocean-going animal, and cover it that deeply, that just speaks to me of the flood. Now, so it's beautiful, and I actually ended up getting a little piece of it. I could not afford this shell. It was this big. It was this big. They had some of them framed. This particular one I've got a picture of cost $60,000. I didn't quite have that on me, so I bought myself about a 2-inch square piece. That's about all I could afford, but it's beautiful. And this beautiful piece can only be described as being in a worldwide flood and buried to a depth of 6,000 feet. Explain that, how that could happen. Anyway, now if evolution was true, what sort of evidence would we expect? Fossil series showing transitions, in other words, evolution in there. Simple life in deeper strata? No, we have complex things like trilobites with eyes, very developed. Fewer species? No, we're losing species all the time. Every year we're losing more species. We're not developing new ones. Macroevolution going on today. We don't see any major changes. If creation was true, we would expect a lack of transition. And stasis. What's stasis? Staying the same. It's the opposite of evolution. Let me give you an example. In other words, even when you have an animal that lived for millions of years, let's say T-Rex just for the fun of it. Let's say T-Rex lived supposedly 73 to 65 million years. So about 8 million years was their lifespan, supposedly. Okay, so if you look at the 73 million year old one and compare it to the 65 million year old one, do you have any changes? Do you have a modern version versus an older version? No, you have the same version. So the animals did not show changes even within their fossil record. Do you follow? So there's no modern versions going on. Okay, stasis and complex life forms and more varieties in deeper strata. Now, big problem for creationists is why things are always in the same levels that we find them in. Now, this is Dr. Leonard Brand of Loma Linda, and he did an experiment to try to recreate this kind of footprint in this sandstone, Coconino sandstone from near the Grand Canyon. They have this is a rock I have in my collection, about this long, this wide. The footprints are about 1 inch wide, and this represents a clawed lizard of some kind. And because it's sandstone, they've thought that this was a desert scene with not water involved. But yet there's this mounding behind each footprint. He wanted to see if he could duplicate this mounding. In other words, how was this formed? So he got sand, put it in a tank, got a salamander. You're my volunteer. Start walking. So it started walking in dry sand. Could not make this footprint. They wet the sand. Could not make the footprint. They put a lot of water in there. Still couldn't make it. Put so much water in there that the salamander literally was splashing as it was walking, and that did it. So what you have here are footprints of a lizard, several lizards. You can see 3, one right after the other, all going in this direction, apparently doing what? Escaping rising floodwaters, trying to go toward high ground. Now, why is that important? We're trying to explain why dinosaurs are only in certain layers. In my mind's eye, when I was a kid, I imagined the flood as being a gigantic washing machine thing, with just throwing everything around and mixing everything, so when the waters subsided, everything would be a homogeneous kind of mixture. That's not the way it is. We find animals in certain layers, starting with marine animals and then land animals and so forth, and birds up higher. So what happened apparently is the waters did this. And animals had time to react, which also explains the bigger question of people. Where are the people? Because the people would have had some weeks to figure out what they needed to do. And as Patriarchs and Prophets says about people, they got to the very highest mountains. Hang on to that thought as we get along here. So that means that dinosaurs and other things got to certain highest levels wherever they were in their communities, got covered up, and they were buried in their same general neighborhoods, shall we say, and not mixed with other global communities. So that's why things are somewhat sorted. How big was the ark? Incidentally, what's an ark? Shh, kids. What's an ark? Because Moses had an ark and Noah had an ark. What's an ark? Container, box. God did not tell Noah, build me a boat. It's a different word in Hebrew. He said, build me a box. And as I was talking to the kids, because some of them brought a couple of rock collections and beautiful little boxes they had, I said, do you guys at home have a special box that you put your special things in? Yeah. God told Noah, build me a special box, and I'm going to put my very precious things in. Now, that's what the ark is. Okay, how big? 450 feet, and that's based on what measurement? Cubits. What's a cubit? Show me a cubit. Gentlemen. Okay, yes, right, from here to here. Okay, 18 inches, foot and a half, if we're talking about Moses-sized men. If we're talking about Noah-sized men, well, I'll just let you go with that. Okay, anyway, but let's go conservative. And 450 feet, million and a half cubic feet capacity. If you use standard train cars, how many would it take to fill the ark? 522. So actually the capacity was pretty good. And incidentally, the dimensions of the ark are very similar to a supertanker, an oil supertanker, which is not designed to go sailing, but rather designed to withstand high seas and not capsize. So anyway, that's what it's designed for. I've heard we could not possibly have had all the species in the world, so we're not talking about species. What are we talking about? Genera or even up to families? I heard a very good professor of biology from Southern Adventist University give a talk on what he imagined the animals to have been. Because the Hebrew word kinds, baramin, we don't know what that means exactly. It's not a scientific term that we can relate to exactly. Animals got in by their kinds. Okay, it might have been family. In other words, cats, a cat family, 2 from the cat family, 2 from the wolf family, for all the dogs and so forth that we have, would have enough genetic material. So we could even have had 16,000 animals plus a year's provision and still have over half of the ark left. And I asked the kids the question, why was the ark so big? And they came up with the answer pretty quick. Let's see if the bigger kids do. Why was the ark so big? More people is the correct answer. God made room for more people. Because I hear all kinds of creative things about, well, for babies or for poop or for, anyway. It was God provided more room for more people to have been saved. I'm going to end up with just a couple more here. That means you've got to come up with, guess what? If we came out of Africa 1 to 2 million years ago, which is standard view, you should be walking down the streets of Sutherland like this. Excuse me. Pardon me. Excuse me. Where are all the people? We should have many more times the people we have today. And this is a population expert that's complaining about this. That means you've got to come up with a hypothesis for an event that wiped out the vast majority of that genetic variation. Something caused the human population to drop drastically. When or how often that may have happened is anybody's guess. Possible culprits include, environmental disaster. What are they saying? I don't know. Our population got down to like 8 people. What could have done that? That's exactly what they're saying there. I just think that is so funny. I just want to, be the kid in the room that, oop. I think I know what happened. So, what happened to the evidence of pre-flood man? This is a tough verse for me to read. And the Lord was sorry that he'd made man on the earth. He's grieved in his heart. Incidentally, that word heart there is not that pumping thing. It means gut. It hurt God right here. That he had made man. But the Lord said, I would destroy man whom I've created for the face of the earth. And that word means to wipe off. I'm going to wipe man off the face of the earth. Pretty much did it, didn't he? Why? Because the man's thoughts were only evil continually. And the area of evil that he especially went to was violence. And if God, this is how patient God is, waited till one family left. And if that one family had perished, how would Jesus be born? That family had to provide the line for Jesus. Or Adam and all the others prior would not have been saved. He waited that long, until he acted. It's a good thing he did act, or you and I would not have the hope of salvation today. Okay, and I kind of think meteors may be involved, but the flood waters fled at the voice of thy thunder. They hastened away. The mountains rose. 26,000 foot level of Mount Everest, 26,000 foot level. There are seashells on the rock, 5 miles up. How did they get there? Was the water up there, or was the mountain here and rose up? That's what happened. The mountains rose. Okay, and finally, there will be scoffers in the last days, walking according to their own lusts and saying, where's the promise of his coming? Who are they scoffing at? Somebody talking about Jesus coming. An Adventist, believing in the second advent. Scoffers will be scoffing at people talking about the second coming, and this is their support for their view. For since the fathers fell asleep, all things continue as they were from the beginning. In other words, uniformly, without any catastrophic involvement of God in the history of man, everything continues on with no big changes. For this, they willfully forget that God did create everything by his word, and also the flood happened. The world was perished, being flooded with water. So there is a couple of major steps of God into history. Does it sound like we're living in those last days where they're making fun of this whole subject? Oh, yeah. And finally, as in the days before the flood, they were eating and drinking, marrying and giving in marriage until the day that Noah entered the ark and did not know until the flood came and took them all away, so also will the coming of the Son of Man be. Jesus clearly thought the flood was historical. And based on that historical event, he said that's exactly the way it's going to be when he comes. Remember, John the Baptist said, I baptize you with water. There's coming someone after me that will baptize with fire. Water is a cleansing agent, but it's temporary. Fire is more permanent. So the world has been cleansed once with water. It will now be cleansed with fire, and that's more permanent. Talk about global warming. Here we go, very soon, when Jesus comes back. And it is going to catch the world completely off guard, even though there's been preaching, even though the word has gone out, even though the message like Noah has been heard. Nevertheless, people will be living the day-to-day things they do now, and suddenly Jesus will come and catch them off guard. Folks, the reason I talk about this stuff is to help people prepare. Get ready. There's nothing more important than this. And I hope you are ready. Amen? Going to be ready? All right. There's nothing more important. Let's pray. Heavenly Father, thank you for the evidence of the flood. The evidence of the flood is something that we can build on and make support for our belief in Jesus is coming. And we know that we will be laughed at. That's been predicted. There will be scoffers laughing at those who say that you've been involved in man's history like this. Heavenly Father, we thank you that Jesus is a carpenter and has gone to heaven and built places for us to inhabit. We look forward to that day, Lord, because this world seems to be quickly on the same route, the same path that pre-flood world was, with violence and very few time for people to think of you. So, Lord, help us to think of you and be ready for the great day, we pray in Jesus' name. Amen.